So thanks very much, Paul.
Okay, thanks. Excuse me. Thanks very much, Sinead, and welcome everybody to this afternoon's third lecture of the Knowledge with Impact Series 2025 in the Faculty of Education at UL. This is the second series of Knowledge with Impact public lectures, which aim to share innovative ideas, foster meaningful discussions, and showcase research that makes a real difference in our communities. So particular thanks to our speakers this afternoon for volunteering to share the research, and the speakers today, come from different stages in their academic careers, and then a warm welcome to anybody in terms of external collaborators and guests. Now the event is going to be recorded and then it'll be shared on the EHS YouTube channel. And as Sinead mentioned, about 20 minutes for each presenter, and then a Q&A for about 5 minutes. So the first talk then is what's a student council? Initial findings in student-led negotiated curriculum for democratic education through the Needs Project. Speaker here this afternoon is Éabha Hughes, is a recent graduate of biology and physics teaching for post-primary at the University of Limerick, and is an Irish Research Council Government of Ireland postgraduate scholar. As an early career researcher and PhD candidate at the School of Education, the doctoral research focuses on democratic education and student-led curriculum design through the negotiating essentials for education in democratic societies. And the work explores the affordance of negotiated integrated curriculum for DCE through democracy, fostering meaningful learning and placing student voice at the centre of the curriculum. So what I'll do is I'll hand over to Éabha at this point, and Éabha, you've about maybe about 20 minutes, and then we'll have a bit of Q&A after that, and then we'll head over to hear from Joanne. So.
Super. Thank you so much for that, Paul. Can you all see my slides okay?
Yes, can see your slides.
Super. So you're all very welcome to my presentation on what's a student council. So this is the initial findings for my PhD research, negotiating the essentials for education in democratic societies. So to begin, I'd just like to welcome you all and say thank you so much to Sinead Liston and Dr. Lynn Kinsella for the opportunity to present here today in the Knowledge for Impact lecture series. And thank you to my supervisors, Dr. John O'Reilly, Dr. Orla McCormick, and Dr. Emmanuel O'Grady. So to begin, I'll provide a brief overview of what this lecture will cover. So brief overview of what is Needs, what is the negotiated integrated curriculum approach that we're using for this type of work, a bit about the conceptual framework underpinning the work, the methods I'm using, and then some of the initial findings that we've actually found. So what is Needs? Needs stands for Negotiating the Essentials for Education in Democratic Societies. And my research questions are, what are the affordances for negotiated integrated curriculum for global citizenship education through democracy? And what are the affordances of this type of student-led curriculum for student voice, participation, self-direction, well-being, and agency? And it's my hope for this type of work where students' voices are placed at the center of curriculum. It's my hope that this will support sustained engagement, sustained authentic engagement, and will empower students to negotiate meaningful learning with their teachers. And this type of work will hopefully demonstrate how students and their teachers can co-construct a robust pathway towards democratic education. And this is then done by utilising the negotiated integrated curriculum and the space provided in the formal junior cycle framework for short courses to achieve this. So for anyone who's not familiar with post-primary schooling in Ireland, I've just provided a very, very brief overview of how it works. Traditionally, Irish education was dominated by a focus on terminal exams to determine university entrance. We have the junior certificate, which is a 3-year program, then an intermediate kind of transition year between our lower and higher levels of post-primary schooling. And then you have the Leaving Cert, which is a 2-year program. Originally, the junior cert was revised in 2010 to make it more relevant and meaningful for students. And then in 2015, we had a very big curricular reform, which transitioned junior cert to junior cycle, and that placed a much greater emphasis on student voice and student agency. And at the point of design, it allowed for a lot more flexibility within the curriculum. And we saw the introduction of junior cycle short courses, which allow for 100 hours of student engagement. And you can take short courses off the shelf from our national curriculum agency. So a school has the freedom to choose, if their students want to do a digital media and literacy course or a Chinese language course or anything like that. The NCCA has provided off the shelf courses that you can use. But the point of the short courses in junior cycle is that any school, any teacher, any class of students should be free to design their own short courses based on meaning that's relevant, based on learning that's relevant to the school and the context and the students in front of them. So the space exists within formal curriculum to allow for this flexibility, but very few schools have actually engaged with this element of junior cycle as intended. In terms of an international context, just to give a broader overview, UNESCO has said that we need a new social contract for education to repair injustices while transforming the future, and that this new social contract should be grounded in human rights based on principles of non-discrimination, social justice, respect for life, human dignity, and cultural diversity, and that this must strengthen education as a public endeavour and a common good. And these concerns are also reflected by UNICEF, who say that democracy is backsliding, and again calling for a new social contract for education to reinvigorate democracies. But both UNESCO and UNICEF recognize that no blueprint to achieve this actually currently exists. So hopefully, this is where negotiated integrated curriculum and the needs project comes in. So IC is a 10-step process whereby students and teachers co-construct a curriculum based on students' personal and global concerns. And this process explicitly places student voice at the center of curriculum making. So they start by generating personal concerns about themselves, their families, maybe their local communities. They group them together. Then they move on to generating world concerns. They group their world concerns together. Then they take their personal and global concerns, group those together and find themes between them. They remove overlap, share the themes with their class, and then students will vote democratically on a theme to essentially learn about this for the next 3 years. Once they've chosen a theme, they start generating questions, selecting activities, and then students and teachers together will co-construct a unit of learning together. So this builds on previous work conducted in 7 schools in the Limerick region. So we had a mix of primary and post-primary schools. And that original work with NIC was found to have a very positive impact on student engagement, agency, and meaningful learning. So the 10-step negotiated integrated curriculum process forms the beginning of the needs negotiated learning short course. So again, that 100 hours that's provided by the formal curriculum. So a brief overview of the conceptual framework that underpins this work. To start by conceptualizing what's meant by voice, agency, and how it's framed within the context of needs, what I've found in my reading is that student voice can often be limited to these tokenistic approaches, like sitting on student councils, where students are obliged to present an opinion on something, but they're often restricted in how they can actually act on that opinion, or they're denied the responsibility to act on that opinion. Or, there's also the danger of speaking for others, where the students who are most confident to give their voice may be the only ones that are heard. So these superficial approaches to voice, which lack students having a substantive influence on their education, won't lead to meaningful educational change or engagement. And this in turn denotes what O'Reilly and O'Grady term as having a lack of authentic voice in their education. So if their voice is treated in an inauthentic manner, then students won't see any meaning or reason for participating. Maniukina, Wise, and Norman also argue for allowing students to have a voice in their education and take ownership of their learning experiences, highlighting the importance of student agency in shaping curriculum and pedagogy. And building on this, O'Reilly and O'Grady argue that student voice is dynamic and it goes beyond just the mere expression of words, or opinions to encompass active engagement, agency, and participation in the educational process through voice as participation. And this is where the relationship between voice, agency, and participation is framed within needs. Manukina, Wise, and Norman also argue that there's this reciprocal causality between structure and agency. And I would go further to argue that there's a reciprocal causality between voice, participation, and agency. And this is also conceptualized by Priestley, Robinson, and Bishta, where they argue that agency is something one does and not something you have, and that we act by means of our environment. Hence, agency is moderated by these discursive social and material environments. And Priestley, Robinson, and Bishta also argue in the context of teacher agency that it's moderated by these dimensions of iterational, practical or evaluative, and projective dimensions, or past, present, and future. And I agree with this argument and use it to further contextualize student and teacher agency and how it's framed within needs. So O'Reilly and O'Grady argue this concept of student voice as being a fundamental driver of curriculum, with then authentic engagement and agency as emergent properties. And I accept the arguments of Manukina, Priestley, and O'Reilly and O'Grady in that agency is something that we do and it's not something we have. It's moderated then by our environment. And within the formal curriculum, you have constraints all influencing the enactment of voice, agency, and engagement. And these things are also influenced by an individual's ideology, their positionality, student and teacher beliefs about, their role within education, the purpose of education. And so if the environment is subject to change, then we can work towards creating forms of active, authentic, and sustained engagement and a substantially more meaningful learning and democratic learning experience for both students and teachers. So ultimately, Needs examines the way in which students engage with curriculum, with voice as a fundamental driver of that curriculum, allowing students to act agentically within curriculum. And as teachers begin to experience students acting agentically, this ultimately, hopefully, changes the power dynamic within the classroom, changes identities, and changes beliefs about our roles within and the purpose of education. So that all brings me back to the negotiated integrated curriculum. So we're utilizing NIC and 100 hours of what Noreen Hayes terms as unhurried time within the formal junior cycle short course framework to engage in an empirical evidence-based study of the affordances of NIC for global citizenship education across 4 different, very different primary schools, post-primary schools in Ireland, with 1 to 3 teachers per school over the 3 years of the junior cycle. But this is, I recognize, an ambitious approach to curricular change. And for this to be realized, you need to create the conditions under which participants can engage with the work for a prolonged period. So to do this, Needs adopts a dual methodological approach, drawing on educational change theory to enable this. So UNESCO recognizes the need for change to reinvigorate democracy, but also recognizes that there's no blueprint to achieve this yet. And ambitious educational change often fails because it fails to take account of teachers' busy lives in, an already packed curriculum. However, Needs and the negotiated learning short course that we have, the difference is that it already exists within space provided by the formal curriculum. And then this is enabled by a socio-ecological approach, drawing on the works of Tagaman, Barrera, and Priestley and Alvungar. And this essentially helps us create the conditions under which participants, most crucially the teachers, can engage with the work for a prolonged period. So all actors within the system need to be aligned and supported with a shared sense of purpose. And by enacting this type of socio-ecological approach, it unites and coheres all the different layers and actors within the system. So this has enabled us to form a professional learning community where we've drawn together key stakeholders from the NCCA, the NAPD, Worldwide Global Schools, and the ACCS, EHSA, the ETB, Joint Managerial Board, and each of our 4 schools together into one kind of cohesive community. This then brings me to our socio-cultural approach that is adaptable, responsive, and sensitive to local contexts, where you begin with having the voice of students where they actually feel taken seriously, they feel heard, and they can see the influence that their voice has on their own education. This is also informed by the Lundy model of participation of space, voice, audience, influence. You have constraining factors influencing the curriculum, and essentially you've got students and teachers coming together to collaboratively identify a concern and collaboratively identify a concern that they're going to explore together. This develops then a big shared intent of the learning through collective shared sense making, whereby the meaning is shared between the intended content, the process by which it's learned, the inclusion means, and how the actual content is assessed. Then ongoing work is supported by developing student self-direction and taking intelligent action through cooperative social inquiries, which in turn then hopefully leads to a cultural congruence where you've got deliberative discussions occurring, developing tolerance and understanding, and we start to see these agentic forms of engagement emerging. And finally, in evaluating the work, where the intent and the design of the assessment and what is assessed and how it is assessed is all shared between the students and teachers. And this becomes quite a reflective and inclusive process then. And this all hopefully facilitates autonomy and ownership over the entire curriculum with a sense of collective good and shared meaning, which also supports their well-being. So hopefully that helps contextualize needs and how we're facilitating the enactment of this type of work across our 4 post-primary schools, which are very different contexts. So a little bit about the methods I'm using. I visit each of the schools every month, so observational school visits, and there are field notes taken based on those visits. There are focus groups with students and teachers. I've done historical interviews with the teachers. Student artifacts are also used, and the teachers are engaging in close to practice research through practitioner inquiry and Brookfield's critical incident technique. And then I've also developed survey toolkits for student well-being based on the EPOC measure of adolescent well-being, self-direction based on the best self-direction toolkit, and a survey for voice and participation based on the works of Quaglia and the Hub No participation framework. So essentially the timeline for all of this, my first year of the PhD was conceptualizing, designing, planning, training the teachers, all of that. Then the second year is where the actual school's intervention begins. We're just completed the first year of the school intervention now, and that will run for the next 3 years. I'll be collecting data for the first 2 years, but in the final year of my PhD, which will be the third year of the school intervention, I'll still be engaging with the schools, doing those monthly visits, staying very close to the participants. I just won't be collecting data during that period. I'll be writing up my thesis. So on to some of the initial findings. The first round of data collection is now complete. The second round is currently in process, and the bulk of this will be processed over the summer. But this is just to provide some kind of initial insights into what we found. So far we've had
just Éabha, you have about 5 minutes. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Paul. So we've had 17 classroom observations with field notes documented and analysed so far, and continuing to visit each of the schools every month. Then I have 8 teacher semi-structured interviews and 4 teacher focus groups, and then 12 student focus groups. And the focus groups for students and teachers, they focus on things like agency and developing competencies for democratic culture. And I'm analysing coding these through in vivo. And there will be more focus groups at the end of the school year. And then finally, each of the 3 surveys, those toolkits have been deployed to students. First round is collected, and they'll be doing that again at the end of May. So when you give students the space to talk, you can often find quite interesting, or you can hear quite surprising things. So on my first focus group with one of the schools, a student asked, "What's a student council?" To which another student jumped in and responded, all I know is first years can't be on the student council, so I don't know. You know, um, what was interesting and fairly expected was getting the students and teachers comfortable with this type of learning took a while. Initially, the teachers are making most of the decisions, and the students kind of, this is a very different approach to a classroom. They're not used to learning in this kind of way. They're not used to making these types of decisions, which led to initial confusion. But um, the majority of students and teachers, they've started to get used to the roles and the routines. It's becoming much more familiar. And the flexible design of this allowed for teachers to spend a lot more time on just getting comfortable with this. For example, having classes around what makes a good question or what is a concern. And students have begun to really take charge and are engaging now in work that's very meaningful to them. So, for example, at the beginning of the school year, a student said, teachers should be in charge of like how much work we should do, and you should be in charge of getting that work done. To which, in response, another student said, but it could be 50-50. You do it half the time, the teacher gets to decide half the time. Another student said, when something comes up and you're actually interested and you want to learn more about it, but the teacher has to move on. I understand, but you have 6 years in here, so everyone should get to understand it properly. So it highlights that students do want to learn in a different way, and they want to be able to spend more times on things that are meaningful to them. Um, in the 4 schools, we've got 9 classes of this. So, for example, one of the groups is looking at adolescent anxiety and the impact of school. And this group has surveyed students and teachers. They've contacted local mental health services. They've developed a mental health walk. They've self-divided tasks and they're developing this kind of collective responsibility. The students are policing each other. And they're developing a positive mutual interdependence. Another class looking at farm safety with a particular focus on physical and mental well-being. They have started developing tolerance and a shared intent for what they want their learning to actually look like. And their relationships within the class with other students are actually improving. So one of the students said, we all have a pretty good relationship with each other. We know people better and we know other people in our classes. I feel like we all do have a good relationship with each other and we listen to our decisions and are able to express ourselves.
2 minutes, 2 minutes.
Thank you. Another group is looking at homelessness and it's changing what's expected of 12-year-old students and their beliefs about their role and capacity. So these students are currently looking at, drugs and gambling and addiction and things that you wouldn't typically steer a class towards. Really what I'm beginning to see is changes in beliefs about the role of students and the role of teachers in education. And students are becoming increasingly self-motivating. And this is something that's noted again and again every time I visit the schools by the teachers. One student said, you can express yourself more. In negotiated learning, you've got to hear from the teachers and the students both together. And finally, I'll just give an example of in one of my recent school visits during a classroom walking debate where the motion was drivers should have increased access to fund public transport. Essentially, all the students said, no, this is unfair, they shouldn't, da da da. But at the bottom of the slide there in the blue box, this was the quietest student in the class who I hadn't heard speak before in previous observations. But this student piped up and said, I think people won't leave cars for buses. We need more focus on self-improvement to reduce carbon emissions. If we just ask them to go on buses, it won't work. We need to teach them in schools. Start in primary school, like junior infants. You need something more deeply rooted. So that was a wonderful example of a student developing their confidence and kind of reflecting that we have the space and the unhurried time for the students that wouldn't typically be heard to find their voice, find their space, and come to the fore. So those are just some of the initial findings for this research. And again, the bulk of the analysis will be done over the summer. But I'd like to thank the supporters of NEEDS. And then we also have a website at needsireland.eu. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. Those are my references, and that is me. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Éabha. Well done. Very interesting, inspiring, thoughtful work underway.